This is Frankie Leonardi. I'm the communication chair for the Historical Society. And just a couple of things. We have everybody on mute. We ask you to stay on mute. You could take yourself off, but we ask you to stay on mute so we keep the ambient noise in the background to a minimum. And we are also recording this session, so it'll be on our website soon, and you'll be able to watch it. And you can also ask questions as we go along by using the chat feature. Just type questions in and I'll be keeping track of those. And if I need to interrupt Jim during the presentation for a specific question, I'll do that. Otherwise, we will hold those questions to the end. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jim Bokrin.
Very good. And thanks everybody for being here and in our second Zoom meeting for the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. And we have a pretty exciting session that is lined up on the early history of Vance, Sturgeon, and Benson lakes. Those are the westernmost lakes on the Manitowish Chain, and they have a really rich history. The image that we have here is actually from an exciting series of magazines from 1918 during World War I. And you can see the hats worn by these folks portaging from Ra Lake down to Vance Lake through the second cutting you see growing up there, kind of holding on to the patriotism of the day. All right. And as we move on, and I seem to be having a little problem. There we go, advancing my slides. You can see Ra Lake on the right, but starting from the west, it's Benson Lake right here, Sturgeon Lake, and Vance Lake. And below is the Outers map from that magazine from 1918, showing in different scale the same area. And we'll be relying heavily on that article and some of those maps throughout this. We're going to start at the far west at Benson Lake, and we're going to be looking at several items. We're going to look at the impact of logging drives. We're going to look at why Benson Lake was omitted and Ojibwa usage of the Benson Lake area. So let's go take a peek. First of all, and again, it seems like, there we go. First of all, we have a lot of logging going on throughout the entire region. And one of the things that's really quite amazing about this is that a lot of the water that was flushed down from the Ra Lake Dam had an extraordinary effect on the entire region. And you can see here in the yellow lines, enough water is collected to enable them to gather logs and flash them down streams. But this is also detrimental to the navigation below Eau Claire. When they would make these dams, they would hold so much water back that steamboats would actually, and boats would rest on the bottom of Eau Claire. And when they would open up the dams, they would fly water down through there and flood the town. They would often use these breakaway dams, as you see right here. What we have next is a trig map. Now, this is a map that the big yellow arrow here is pointing at Benson Lake. And if you see here, this is an 1862 survey. So you see 1862s on the right, 1865 surveys on the left, the yellow arrows in 1862. The original surveyors cited both on Ra Lake and on Benson Lake that logging was already taking place, predating a lot of original views of logging. So they would be using those rough breakaway dams. It's interesting as we move to 1879 and a series of documents that we're going to be using extensively. Ra Lake and the Manitowish River, above that area, there's a considerable amount of pine that is mostly second growth. And it shows you that early on in the 1870s, a lot of logging had already happened within the region. So what does that do to Benson Lake and the flashing of the logs? Well, this image on the left is from the boat landing in the river going into Benson Lake. And that is a very wide area, and it's flattened out from the sand. We're going to have some pictures of this. And the image on the right is looking across all of Benson Lake to the outlet. And this is where a big sand region was. I always like putting this element into all of my presentations because in 1846, A.B. Gray, a geologist, paddled through Manitowish Waters and said, although the stream is curved around in every direction, occasionally opening it up into small and picturesque lakes surrounded by high land with excellent pineries, and narrowing again to a width barely sufficient for the passage of a canoe. So let's go back and look at that slide. On the far left, this is the river. It was formerly barely wide enough to get a canoe through. Just giving you an idea of the hydrology and the volume of water that was pushed through that area. Well, one of our first mysteries here, if you look at the GIS map on the top, there's Benson Lake. You look at the original survey from 1862, and guess what? We have no Benson Lake. The reason why that probably happens is you see the exterior of the survey line that I'm following with my pointer that goes around. Those section lines don't cross the lake. And a lot of times the original surveyors did not go into the interior of the sections that they were mapping. So that's probably why it doesn't exist there. And then the other elements are so clearly developed, but it shows up later. But in 1847, the Owen expedition, a geologist that came 1 year after A.B. Gray, here we got One Pine Lake, which is Benson Lake, the westernmost lake in the chain, and it steps right in this area. This lake here, with the portage going to South Turtle, this is Rest Lake, so that's a perfect fit and a pretty good lock for the historic record. And getting back to A.B. Gray, he marked the westernmost lake along the chain as well. So Benson Lake shows up all the time. People ask me often, what makes this a lake? It's pretty small by comparison. And oftentimes the answer is it's the depth. It's how deep the water was and the ecology that goes along with it. So back to Benson Lake and Outer Magazine. So here we have that World War I garb. Everybody's wearing this with a strong sense of nationalism, looking across Benson Lake in these picnic areas. If you look at the Outers map, they have camping grounds marked right at the inlet of Benson Lake, and then around the corner on the peninsula there. So Benson Lake was really quite active and important. Now, Benson Lake was really important for river drive logging. Basically, all the logs had to go through that little lake. That's why we got those sandbars and those big river channels. But they only drive the white pine down the river. So here we have a modern map by a guy named James P. Kaysen, and it shows railheads coming into the Benson Lake area. That would be, if you look at the map on the left, the Flambeau Lumber Company out of Lac de Flambeau. And they had a spur line that ran all the way up Powell Road into this region. You can see that extension from that spur line right here, marked by the yellow arrows, going right into Benson Lake. As an aside, if you look here at the inlet of the lake, look at this huge sandbar that was pushed up by all the flashing of the logs and the like. But here at the arrows, they would take out the hardwoods, softwoods, and other logs that weren't suitable for river drive logging. So Benson Lake early on was a real hub of logging activity. One of the earliest resorts that we had was also Patterson's Resort. I'm going to go back one. And Patterson's Resort is right up here at the outlet of the lake, down a few hundred yards, and it runs along the shore. And it really is a cool resort. There's elements of the resort there still today, and their signature cabins named after wildlife. Now, what we're going to do here is take a little bit of a journey through all three lakes regarding its history with sturgeon and the abundance of sturgeon within the area. Sticking with Benson Lake, If any of you remember Les Jacobson, he was the keeper of the Sturgeon, if you will, and had a property right at the outlet of Benson Lake, not Sturgeon Lake, but and he would watch them and he would know all of them and did a lot of great research and did some work on spawning and rearing fish from these lakes at the Wild Rose Fish Hatchery that released in the turtle flambeau flowage. So that tradition runs long. But historically, this is big. The big rapids here down around the Highway 51 bridge below the biking bridge, and then above Sturgeon Lake, the little rapids that they call, are considered to be prime sturgeon grounds. As for the Ojibwe, historically, this is one of the most important and active food resources they have in their seasonal rounds and cycles. So this is the big rapids below Sturgeon Lake running in high water and pushing very swiftly through the region. Here's a view to the right of that same shot up on the high sand banks there. And that is where the DNR, working with Les Jacobson, actually captured the fish that they stripped the milt and eggs from for that sturgeon research. Now, if you go to the Little Rapids, which were above Sturgeon Lake, the view is on the right. You can see looking down into the lake and how it narrows. I've moved to the left, though, an image really down in Arkansas. And what occurs is Native Americans would create weirs where they would move rocks to create funnels or channels in which the fish would congregate. If you look at this area on the right above Sturgeon Lake, and we look at it on an aerial photo, this is a modern aerial photo, you can see it almost makes a perfect funnel effect here. And the sturgeon would be coming up into this area, and it would be a perfect area for a weir. Of course, any evidence of a weir would have been blasted to pieces by River Drive logging. So as we go forward, I have these excellent pictures of Wisconsin sturgeon spawning. This is what it looks like on the Wolf River near Shiocton. The sturgeon are docile. They line up and they just wait to do their business. It's kind of interesting, as I was doing research, there was these historic images of Ojibwe using spears, but mostly nets for gathering in the springtime. And then I went on the DNR website, and then here they are. All of these individuals who are DNR researchers, and they're using the exact same nets, and they're scooping off ashore, and they're picking up the sturgeon for the purpose of measuring them and doing research. So it is kind of a neat connection between modern uses and historic uses and their absolute similarities. But this is a big feature of Sturgeon Lake, not surprisingly. If you take a look here, this is John Brenner, renowned guide of the area with a beautiful sturgeon back when they harvested them from these lakes. I also want to point out on the far left where that yellow arrow is, that special oarlock there. We're going to get back to that in just a moment. But sturgeon fishing was very popular on the chain through about the 1970s, I believe. So we go to Sturgeon Lake, and I've talked already about the Ojibwe and their use of the fish weirs. And the DNR in the Upper Rapids removing the logging boom structure because there's a real neat history with River Drive logging. And then we're going to go to the Lockhorn Lodge to learn about the Starts and Bruner family and about that oarlock. So again, back in the 1862 and 1865 surveys, the survey of Sturgeon Lake was a little bit off too. The river was not depicted in that as well. If you take a look at the GIS map here, you can see Sturgeon Lake has a big bay in the original survey with the lower yellow arrow. That bay is less pronounced here. But what you'll also possibly explain that if a lot of water came through there, it may have actually eroded that bay to a great extent because there is a sandbar at that part of the area. Moving logs downriver like white pine was a great deal of work. The river rats would push the cork pine down the river. They'd have to stamp them with branding axes so that they could sort them out at the mills. And here you see them trying to move these mammoths down the river themselves. Here, these images are above the Little Rapids, or the rapids above Sturgeon Lake. You see on the far right a remnant of a large white pine pushed up against the shore, still part of this. And to the left, you see a massive log jam. And you see a large boom projecting from the middle of the river channel. And that boom and boom site was there for quite a while. And the DNR ultimately removed that boom site. For what reason, we're not exactly sure. But this S-turn coming out of Vance Lake was notorious for backing up logs. And this was part of the efforts of the log driving era. So as we leave Sturgeon Lake and on the left, look across the lake, and on the right, look at the top of the rapids, what was called Little Rapids in the Outers map and down, we were sure hoping that we could have some families look through their photo albums and look for any early pictures that might have evidence of that logging boom that was at the top of the rapids. Maybe a canoe trip your parents or grandparents or great grandparents may have taken, and have a photo there. That would be something we'd hope you'd share with us at the Manitowish Waters Historical Society as we solve these mysteries. But now we're going to talk about the Starts family, Peter Starts. On the far left, remember the oarlock we spoke of? Starts actually patented and manufactured an adjustable oarlock in his home on Sturgeon Lake while running a wonderful business of a resort with cottages, rooms for rent, guide service, and all the amenities for all the seasons that sportsmen so loved in northern Wisconsin. We have a great aerial photo here, and Jody Miller gave us some really good insights what happened on her grandfather's property. One was a birch bark bridge that went across the Manitowish River. This photo is a 1937 aerial photograph. On the left, there was a number 3 was a garage and an area to park, and this would get folks more quickly to the road to the Manitowish Water Station. And 2 is just a general number that is the residents of the Starts, their cabins and buildings and so on, and also a landing strip for an airplane. And this business was a unique resort in that it had private setting there on Benson Lake and access to the chain. Here's a picture of Peter Vance and Pete Starts, some of the earliest pioneers in the Manitowish Waters area. So we're moving to our last lake already, but it's a pretty significant one to be sure, with a lot of activities, and that is Vance Lake, named after the gentleman we were just looking at with Peter Starts, Pete Vance. We're going to look at the original dam site and why it moved. We're going to talk about the history of River Drive logging, and we're going to explore the fish lock and hatchery, what was unique to our community, and talk about the state forest and some of the buildings that they had in the region. As you look here on the left, we have Vance Lake, and I will point out before we get going, as we get out of the channel out of Rest Lake, notice this big sand spit here. This was all pushed out by erosion. That was created by the flashing of logs through the dam, and that's a lot of Rest Lake sitting in Vance Lake. If you look to the right to an 1878 map, notice that peninsula does not exist. All right. So as we look at the 1918 map of Vance Lake from Outers magazine, we see the Little Rapids here, and the dam area with some private cottages as camping grounds and alike. And this is a 1937 image right here. So when the dam was built, it was surveyed in 1878. And as you can see, the Rest Lake Reservoir was going to be filled at a height of 25 feet. Right now, we're at low water. The dam has about a 3.5-foot head on it right now. So imagine 16.5 more feet of water. We're going to explore that. So the dam was actually not going to be placed where it is located today by the Pea Patch, but really at the outlet of Vance Lake. And the proposed dam is illustrated right here with a large dike that would have to be built. And the Army Corps of Engineers thought this was the best possible dam in the whole watershed. And the problem was that this additional dike was going to take an awful lot of work, but absolutely necessary to hold that water back. The Army Corps of Engineers on the left with a red line shows you how big Rest Lake would have been with a 25-foot head of water. Many of you who have property on the chain, if you look to the right, may have found yourself underwater. And the chain would have been approaching the size of the Turtle Flambeau flowage. But the House of Representatives reduced the total rise to 15 feet. And the question I have is, why did the dam site change in just a 2-year period? And why did they choose to lower it? That question is still unanswered. So if anybody has any ideas about that, we'd love to hear them. Probably after the legislature in 1880 decided to go from 25 feet to 15 feet, Peter Vance, one of our earliest pioneers, probably said, you know, you don't have to spend all your time building this big dike across the top of that water. Just move the dam over here at the outlet of Rest Lake and you'll be good. And that's exactly what happened because it saved time, money, and energy. Here's a picture of Peter Vance on the far left using a logging sled. And on the right, you can see Peter Vance's earlier property, which would have been on the upper part of Sturgeon Lake, and then his home over here closer to what is now downtown Manitowish Waters off of 3030 Road. So we have a dam. They start building in 1887, and it was completed by 1888, and it worked really quite well. But it was quite different than the dam you see here, even though you can see by the Mississippi River Logging Camp, which is a Weyerhaeuser logging camp, it was a pretty robust area as far as its development and cribbing and jetties and plumes for driving logs. This wasn't the first dam built. The nearby logging site reveals something about the animals that were used here and the evolution of logging that came through this area. Notice on the left we have oxen, and on the right we have horses. Recent research has illustrated that oxen were used, according to Peter Vance, until the railroads came. And then horses were used for logging. The reason why that occurred is you need oats and hay and more sophisticated forage for horses, whereas those big lumbering oxen could actually live and operate on marsh grass, which there's an abundance of up and down the Manitowish River. So that's kind of an interesting development. As we go a little bit further too, just at the outlet of Vance Lake, the lake we're speaking of, we have found this giant berm on a slope, way, way bigger than any logging camp structure or blacksmith shop, and it's close to the water. And it may have very well been where those big lumbering oxen spent their time being protected from the elements, being able to easily be watered by an open river, and there's actually barbed wire within the area. This is a protected site and recorded in the archaeological site inventory and on DNR land, and everything there cannot be disturbed. So here we go to the construction of the dam. It was concluded by 1888, and here we have this dandy picture looking upstream, mind you. Notice the gates are on the other side of the Manitowish Lake Dam. Doesn't look like much, doesn't look like the other pictures. Well, we're going to take a look at that. And that dam was actually built by a different group than the Mississippi River Logging Company that ran the camp. But when the big cuts came, the Chippewa Lumber Company and Boom Company ran the logging drives. It doesn't matter. All of these were part of Weyerhaeuser's pool or his syndicate. These are different corporations that he controlled that basically dominated river drive logging in the area. And so looking at this large 1878 map of Rest Lake, we can see that the sponsored dam is going to migrate. And it is not going to create the huge flowage that you see here with the red lines. And we're going to not use this area, and we're going to put the dam over by the pea patch. So here we go back to this image. Take a look at this. There's the old image of the Rest Lake Dam, and we got this from the Flancher family. And if you look at those gates, that's the same dam. And you notice how small the dam is, and the sluice is pretty small for driving logs through. And if somebody's watching right now and saying that can't be right, that house can't be on that side, there's not a high bank, I agree with you. This is such an old image that they used nitro glass slides for their images. That's how far this goes back. And what occurred is when they printed this picture, they reversed the slide. But based on these two corroborating images, and it's part of the Flancher collection, we're certain that's what the first dam in Manitowish Waters looked like. Pretty interesting, less formidable than this dam. Here we go. In 1901, roughly, they produced this more robust dam, and it had a significant effect on the area. You can see the sluice running hard here. All the timbers are straight. This is really quite important. Kay Kranz has found some interesting articles in her research over the winter and has thankfully shared them with us. And here we see a document that shows in 1900 and 1901, the Chippewa Lumber and Boom Company, that's Weyerhaeuser, Frederick Weyerhaeuser, looked to the last great forest in the state. And there it is, us, Manitowish Waters in our region. He bought 75 million feet of standing timber. He already had a lot of timber in the area. He ran one of the biggest log drives ever, 90 million feet of logs were run. It started on April 27th, and it started in Manitowish Waters, and there were 150 river rats. I imagine the bars were pretty active in the days leading up to that event. And these images, sadly, are not of Manitowish Waters, but they do show big scores of river rats and batus and on log jams, and I had to include them for illustrative purposes. As we go on a little bit further, and we take a look at a 1905 article, it says the dam was a big one, holding back hundreds of miles of water at a 12 to 16 foot head. This is the second citation to this level. Remember, right now we're at 3.5, or we're actually at 5.5 feet. We drop at 3.5 feet. I was wrong before. I corrected myself. And raise it to 8.5 feet. As we take a look at the period of 1905, a 16-foot head of water was having devastating effects on the whole area. Ultimately, by 1920, we will see that the logging had subsided. We became an impoundment and a flowage, and a concrete dam that resembles what we enjoy today was right on the road that we call County W, formerly Highway 10 and 51. Another thing that we enjoyed in Manitowish Waters was one of the first ranger stations, one of the first 4 satellite ranger stations outside of the main ranger station in Trout Lake was right here. This is where Angler's Bar is today, just behind Herman Krueger, the ranger who's walking here. But that's a windmill fire tower. They're still putting the roofing on some of the outbuildings and sheds and alike. And this was part of the fire suppression and protection. When you look at those tall pine trees around Anglers, notice that that hill was logged absolutely flat, and everything has grown since the development of the ranger station in 1912. The Department of Forestry also leased land. Political groups like the Progressives under Robert Follett promoted these forest reserve lands in Wisconsin, and the Chicago Northwestern Railroad was also real interested in promoting these as well. You could lease a site for a tent, a cabin, or even a resort. And we had a resort here in yellow on Dam Lake or Vance Lake, and that is right here with Fern Lodge. And that would be right here on the point at the outlet of the Manitowish River from Vance Lake. Interestingly, in 1914, after the water was being raised to 12 feet on a regular basis and 16 feet on other occasions, the small community of Manitowish Waters actually sued the Chippewa and Flambeau Improvement Company to regulate dam usage. And in 1914, we won, basically as a small community because there was so much property damage being done. This was then appealed to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, their capturing of evidence found that fish were being isolated in small ponds and pools, that chunks of as many as 30 large pine trees would be falling into the lake off the slopes from erosion. And that convinced the Supreme Court to decide in the favor of the town. It's interesting, in 1937 and in 2010, the community of Manitowish Waters has had to protect its regulation of the dam, each time successfully protecting it from undue erosion and dam modifications. The Win-Mar Bar is one of the great stories, run by Winnie and Marie, started in 1924. Here it is, a tent. This would be right at Kohler Park across from the Pea Patch. Win-Mar actually becomes the Pea Patch. They moved from this tent, and again, we're at Rest Lake Park on the right, and it is a large structure that reaches down right in front of the dam. The Win-Mar was super popular, and my family actually started coming here and staying on the Win-Mar property. Winnie and Marie also owned the land behind the Win-Mar that was on the Rest Lake Park area. And ultimately, this property was purchased by Charlie and Inez P. They called it the Win-Mar for a while, but it ultimately became the Pea Patch, which is a great area for folks to go and enjoy the view of the dam, a great deal of history. And if you want a real insight into that history, just look at the top of the bar. Lisa and Barry have done an amazing job of creating a historic record of their very own. Speaking of Lisa and Barry, we're coming up on a centennial for them. 1924 will mark the centennial, the first 100 years of operation. And I'm sure that will be quite a shindig when that all gets put together. Looking forward to that. Also on Vance Lake, we had 2 really significant conservation measures implemented in which Manitowish Waters took the lead. We're still on Vance Lake, believe it or not. We have a ways to go. We had the first cooperative or municipal fish hatchery, and the first productive fishway in the state of Wisconsin. So here in Wakefield in 1935, they put in the paper, Spider Lake only has 102 voters, but it's the only town in the state that owns and operates its own fish hatchery. And the hatchery cost us $1,000 as a community, and they located on Highway 51 right off of Rest Lake. So in 1929 to 1930, the Depression hit the Wisconsin Conservation Commission hard. Due to shortfalls in money, they couldn't meet the needs and demands for fisheries. So they created a cooperative hatchery model, okay? It enables towns and counties to establish pike, meaning walleye hatcheries. And look at here, by 1932, we were first and foremost with our fish hatchery, and that's the Spider Lake hatchery. Also, it's located on Rest Lake, but we were the town of Spider Lake. Remember that, that'll be important. So we build our first fish hatchery. We had just become Spider Lake in 1928. Look at this beautiful fish hatchery. And what do we call it? It says Manitowish Waters Fish Hatchery. So by 1940, we'll be known as Manitowish Waters, but it seems that some of our community were already identifying ourselves as Manitowish Waters before that transition occurred, just before World War II. Looking ahead, community members worked with Conservation Commission members using fight nets. They would grab mature walleyes, they would strip the eggs out of the walleyes, and then release these big walleyes back into the water. At that same time, we'll be operating the interior of the fish hatchery, and the eggs and milk would be mixed into the jars. The fry would be collected, and then they would be hatched in these big water troughs. 3 men were tasked with running the fish hatchery from the community, and they work collectively with the Wisconsin Conservation Commission. By 1936, you can see here that we're number 8, but look at on the left, all the other municipal and cooperative fish hatcheries that start throughout the area. We were truly trendsetters. Mercer put theirs below Lake of the Falls. On the left is a upstream view, on the right is a downstream view, and they put their name right on top of it and had the same community pride in taking an active role in fisheries and stewardship. Even off of Big Lake, the CCC boys from Camp Mercer created a large dam here for rearing ponds, because when those fish came out in the fish hatcheries, they needed some space to move around. We also had rearing ponds on Circle Lily Lake, which would facilitate this additional growth. The next item we have is the bar fishway. Sometimes it would be called a fish lock. Some of you would be more familiar with a fish ladder. It was a way to move fish upstream. And this big concrete, I'm on the image on the right here, this big concrete block was a big chamber that filled with water, and the fish would be elevated. This triangular thing on the bottom of it was a timing mechanism that filled with water that lowered and raised the water. And I want to thank the Reala family, and specifically Bob Kovar. He has shared this entire document with the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. You can go on our electronic archives and Past Perfect off of our website and access the whole document for free. So the Conservation Commission says the obstruction of water courses is a huge problem. We haven't had a successful fishway ever. And the first one is going to be in Manitowish Waters. And here is the diagram of the lock on the right of how it works, the bar fish lock. Bar was from ironwood, by the way. And to the left is that triangle timing device that open and close the gate as the fish would go up and down this. So inside of the chamber, the middle picture will show you the gate goes up and down. They actually attract the fish to come into this chamber by running water and jetting it during springtime into the creek below the dam. And the little fish run in there. And then the gate closes based on that timing mechanism that you see on the left here. Then water is added, it rises up, and they still flow water from Rest Lake, and the fish follow the flowing water on the right, and they go right up that chute, and they pop right into Rest Lake. There you have it, a fish lock. The orange arrow on the left shows the entering chamber downstream. On the right, you have the yellow arrow, and that shows where they exit. So the fish lock became kind of popular. And one of the things that Barr was upset about the fish lock is it was in a town and everybody wanted to look at it. And some people maybe wanted to help themselves to fish fry. So they ended up having to build a pretty substantial fence around the top and the bottom, as you can see on the right. Data was taken from the fish locks as well. Fyke nets were put right above Rest Lake, and then the fish were counted every day during the spawning season. And even in town, everybody showed up in their Sunday best in the rain and watched people operate the Fyke nets. See this guy here squatting over, counting fish, and they put it on a postcard because they were so proud of their functioning fish lock. Data results came back that illustrated that the fish lock did indeed work. And walleyes and bass and suckers and lawyers and muskies and sunfish were all making it up there, except one time on June 3rd, the trap sprung a leak and they lost all their fish. Ultimately, the data revealed that most of the fish going up the fish lock were suckers. And slowly, probably by 1947, the fish lock kind of faded. It operated probably until the 1950s. And Michael Dunn, famous Manitowish Waters historian, indicated that when they remodeled the bridge, they threw it in the dump. So that's not a great ending for what was really an exciting opportunity to improve our fisheries. The Wakefield News also went on to illustrate that the town of Manitowish Waters is very serious about securing its fishing seasons. And it decided to extend its opening to May 25th to protect the fish so they could spawn more. It prohibited ice fishing and no fishing after November 1st, because during the Great Depression, they wanted to have people come here and get stringers and walleyes like you see below here. And so that is a lot going on Vance Lake. But there's even more going on. A place called 3030 Lodge, right off of 3030 Road. Bill and Val Mells ran that for a long time. I was told that the interior bar was a former fur trade site, and it became a classic resort and operated for a long time. Val's Smorgasbord was a Saturday night fave, and people from all over would come, and the 3030 Lodge was quite an impressive resort area. Interestingly, the short period of time that the 3030 Lodge was an exotic topless entertainment establishment was actually really quite short-lived. But most people tend to remember the 3030 Lodge for this short-lived cultural flourish rather than the long traditions of their resort. So as I try to bring this to close right around at 45 minutes, which is good, I want to read to you an 1890 canoe trip and the part which covers the three lakes that we've just gone over. So this is 1890. This is the Shields, the famous Shields magazine family, did a canoe trip from Land O'Lakes, state line, all the way to Manitowish when the railroads first got here. And they, I believe, are our first documented tourists. They spent the night at the Mississippi River Lumber Camp and enjoyed a fine meal. and then their guides had to take them to the Manitowish station. And I'll read that to you all in closing. We had a run of 15 miles from the dam to the railroad, and it was an exciting and enjoyable as any part of the entire voyage, except possibly the part where we were nearly drowned on Thousand Island Lake. I might describe in glowing terms the beauties of the autumn morning, the gentle shining of the ancient pines in the October breeze, the rushing, roaring, frightful rapids, the cataracts of the mighty Manitowish, the picturesque figure of the stalwart guide as he stood up in the canoe, pole in hand, and steered her with all the skill of an Iroquois through the boiling, foaming torrents safely into the pool below. How his bronze face took on a look of deep anxiety, and his eagle eyes searched through the intricate windings of the stream for possible hidden dangers, and a lot more of such rot. But I do not feel equal to it tonight. We passed through all the bad places safely, and through all the beautiful curves and gently flowing reaches peacefully, reaching Manitowish Station, 11 o'clock, October 20, 1890. I hope you have enjoyed your little journey through Benson, Sturgeon, and Vance Lake. And I think we're going to move to questions now with Frank
Yeah,
as
Jim,
our
we've got a
moderator.
couple.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got a couple up there. So who owned the dam when it was first constructed? Actually, maybe you can talk about dam ownership over the years.
Certainly. The dam was owned by, let's see if I can pull that slide up, because it's always some variation of Chippewa River something or another. And it was right here. Construction of the first dam concluded by 1888, built by the Chippewa River Improvement and Log Driving Company, not to be confused with the Chippewa Lumber and Boom Company and all the rest of them. But that was the first one. And then they ran this the whole time. And then the Mississippi River Logging Company operated it until 1902, after that big log drive that we talked about it, or yeah, the Mississippi River Logging Company did. Then it went to the Chippewa Lumber and Boom Company, and then they sold it to the the Chippewa Flambeau Improvement Company. How's that?
Great, great. You talk about the water release today is really relative to recreation. How did they cycle the water release back when it was first constructed? Was it multiple times year round, during winters as well as summer?
It's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. So in the early days, when they put in that new dam in 1901, before that huge river drive with 150 river rats, they would raise the water in, the period of April and over the course of winter to 12 to 16 feet. I saw 13 feet often as the level that they would use. And then by July, they would take it to 0. So that means 5.5 feet down from where we are right now. They would take it absolutely to 0. And then they would fill it up again and then push it out. And that had, the terrible erosion effect that ultimately led to that 1914 request by residents to the Railroad Commission just to stop the environmental destruction of the area. And then they gained an operating order. The first operating order was a little bit different. That's why I misspoke before. It lowered the water to 3.5 feet early on. And then later in 1937, they raised it up to 5.5 feet for winter. But they would always keep it around 8 feet during the summer after 1914.
Great, thanks, Jim. I invite you to continue to ask questions using the chat feature. We have another one that's just come in. What did the natives think of all of this?
They hated it because this is another great question. The reason why the Ojibwe came from the East Coast is because of a prophecy and a vision to find Minoman, where food grows on the water, wild rice. You put in these dams, you kill all the wild rice. The wild rice was absolutely destroyed throughout this region. If you look at this map right here and zoom in at the bay by Camp Jordan that I'm circling on, they say there's wild rice there. And there's wild rice up here in Papoose Creek and everywhere else. And there was an Ojibwa community here on the peninsula of Rest Lake. We'll cover that in our Rest Lake session. All of that is completely destroyed. That's why the wild rice fields above the dam on Big Lake became so essential. To go to looking at the Army Corps of Engineer notes, as I have, in Lac de Flambeau. So when the Army Corps of Engineer shows up there, this is after the treaties and all the other challenges the Ojibwe had in Lac de Flambeau. The Army Corps of Engineers shows up in 1879 and said, yeah, we're going to raise the water 4 or 5 feet and we're going to destroy all your wild rice. What do you think? Well, they weren't too pleased. And the Army Corps of Engineers, they put in a lot smaller dam there.
Yeah. Jim, while you're right there on that map, Rest Lake had a different name previously, correct?
It did, but it's hard to know that name, to be quite honest. Rest Lake shows up the first time as Rest Lake in 1879. Prior to that, it is not named on any lake. So logically, it would be a place where coming from Six Paws Portage to Rest Lake to Trout Lake, if you're an Ojibwa or a fur trader or somebody working in those circles, you'd camp there. We know that A.B. Gray camped there. It's a good place to rest. If you're driving logs, that's where the dam is. It's a good place to rest. Even when Shields and his crew came through in 1890, they chose to rest and knocked on the dam keeper's door and got a hot meal at the logging camp. So it's appropriate, but you have to put yourself back to 1879. Who's here then? You only have timber cruisers. You have the Devine family, the first family in Manitowish Waters, and that's it. Peter Vance wasn't even here then.
Jim, are today's seasonal changes in the water levels with the dam an issue for sturgeon reproduction?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question too. Well, the dam has been there since 1887, 1888. So the sturgeon haven't come up over the dam since, all right? I remember when I was a little kid here in the early 1960s, people talked about seeing sturgeon up here, but not very often. There are sturgeon below the dam. They're still there today. You can go out on Benson Lake in particular in like July and August, and they'll come out of the water and breach and slap themselves on the water. It's really cool to watch. But the dam operation does affect the spawning of the sturgeon if the sturgeon can't get up the river. And this has been part of a grand debate that took place in the early 2000s. And I actually was working, though, with Les Jacobson on that and documenting his work with the DNR, and they were successfully capturing sturgeon in the 1990s, and getting eggs and Milton and raising, genetic stock from the Manitowish River to be released in the Turtle Flambeau flowage. And I fished the flowage quite a bit, and now we're seeing these smaller sturgeon breaching, and it comes from that effort. So that's the history of the sturgeon breeding and the water levels that I understand regarding the dam.
Great, thanks. I'm not showing any other questions, Jim, so maybe I'll just ask you, with this being our second Zoom presentation, do you have any others planned for the future?
Well, we were thinking that this would be a good one to do, and we could maybe do Rest Lake as a review in April. And then we're probably going to look at our data and get feedback and pause this during the busier months and maybe re-engage again with a monthly Zoom presentation November-ish. That sounds like what we're experimenting with, but we would really appreciate the feedback from everybody listening, sending us an email to MW Historical Society at gmail.com and let us know what you think we should do. We will record this and put it on our YouTube channel as well. So if you have a friend you want to share that with, it'll probably be up in 2 or 3 days and be there for a very long time.
Well, and it'll probably also find its way to Facebook, Jim. So
okay, that's right.
Be able to find it in a couple places. So
right.
So I think with that, we'll sign off and thank everyone for their attendance. And we really appreciate, and we will get word to you when we have our next one. So with that, we'll say good evening.
Bye-bye. Thanks everybody for tuning in.